The 80s are regarded as a golden era for action role-playing games, or RPGs, and this era was defined by releases such as Rastan Saga, Gauntlet, Rygar, and so on. These RPGs often included adventure storylines, mission systems, and real-time combat, wherein players had direct control over characters' stats, and they laid the foundation for modern-day video games that are relatively easily accessible on PlayStation or Nintendo Switch. Today, we will explore some of the masterpieces that emerged from the RPG genre in the 80s and tell you all about these forgotten gems. Kadash 1990. To kick off this list, we have Taito's arcade action RPG, Kadash, which was in the works in the late 80s before finally releasing in 1990. The game was eventually ported to the TurboGrafx 16 in 1991 and the Sega Genesis in 1992, and it was eventually made available for Nintendo Switch and PlayStation 4 2023. Set in a medieval fantasy world, this game is a typical example within the sword and sorcery genre, and up to 4 players can play the game at once in the arcade version. The gameplay involved side-scrolling platform action, as well as platform RPG systems such as statistics, levels, money, and magic. The plot followed demonic entities who initially lived among humans and were treated as equals before the humans eventually banished them to the underground kingdoms of Kadash. Over time, a demonic wizard named Balog, or Barog, established his rule over the demons and promised his followers that he would free them from their subterranean prison and exact revenge on humans who had exiled them from the world. As Barog's demonic army grows more powerful over the centuries, they eventually unleash war upon humans, who are caught off guard and soon defeated. While most of the land is laid to waste, Barog's greed for power only increases as he eyes the kingdom of Durzir, and even kidnaps Princess Salasa in his hopes of attaining higher power. The arcade game required players to kill monsters and bosses to collect gold, experience, and keys to unlock treasure chests and doors, and had 5 levels with differing environments that ranged from pleasant meadows and caves to underwater kingdoms and Castle Kadash. Black Tiger. Released in August 1987, Black Tiger was notably one of Capcom's earliest arcade hits, and it was inspired by the Japanese game Black Dragon. This game was a later release in the Ghosts and Goblins franchise, and it followed players as they took the role of a barbarian known as the Black Tiger and faced a horde of monsters. The game took place across several open levels with lingering secrets and collectibles, and was set against the backdrop of a dragon invasion in an unnamed kingdom. 3 dragons had somehow unleashed innumerable monsters who stirred up chaos and suffering, while the Black Dragon was tasked with the responsibility of restoring peace and order. Among other tasks, players had to overcome the monstrous obstacles and kill the dragons, and they could spot wise men across the levels and rescue them for some advice on how to defeat the enemies. These wise men also assisted the players in obtaining powerful weapons, keys to treasure chests, armor, and poison antidotes, and players could navigate these levels vertically as well as horizontally. Even though Black Tiger was slightly less challenging than the game's Japanese inspiration, it was a massive hit among other Capcom releases and was eventually made available for Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3. Legend of Makai. Also known as Makai Densetsu in Japan, Legend of Makai was an action PRG that was first released by Jaleco in 1988. This action-adventure game was set in a fantasy world where players had to control a young warrior tasked with saving a helpless princess from an evil wizard. At the start of the game, the player was handed a singular sword and options to purchase other weapons or magical artifacts from the shops. 2 players could play the game at a time with alternating turns, and they had a fixed amount of time to make their way through non-linear levels, unlock doors through hidden keys, and kill any enemies that might wander in their path. Upon its release, Legend of Makai was listed in Game Machine's curated list of top 20 successful arcade games, and it is praised for its mix of action and adventure and favorable graphics. Gauntlet. Released in 1985, Gauntlet was a hack-and-slash video game developed by Atari Games and is considered to be one of the first multiplayer dungeon crawl games ever. The game had some similarities to the 1983 game Dandy, as well as the action-adventure maze video game Time Bandit. Despite its controversial release, Gauntlet was a massive hit among fans, and Atari distributed almost 8,000 arcade units in 1985. The game was initially called Dungeons, and it was designed by game designer Ed Logg for arcades before finally being released for PlayStation and Windows. While the game did not have a cohesive story, players were drawn in by the option to pick a character that best represented them and then attempt to survive for as long as possible. The gameplay took place in a top-down, third-person view wherein players had to navigate a labyrinth and find the exit for each room while their health slowly declined. They also had to collect items for survival and scoring, as well as access treasure rooms to gain extra power and bonus points. In the original design, the game only had a joystick and 2 buttons labeled Fire and Magic, and it debuted 4 iconic characters called Elf, Valkyrie, Warrior, and Wizard. A monster named Generators spawned other entities such as Demon, Ghost, Grunt, and Sorcerer, who all had varying levels of strength, and players were tasked with destroying the generators to put a stop to the influx of monsters. Rygar, developed and published by Tecmo for arcades. Rygar was a 1986 platform video game with options for a single player, as well as a multiplayer mode. The game labeled the player as a legendary warrior who was tasked with the responsibility of defeating numerous enemies across levels with the help of a singular weapon known as the Discarmor. This weapon can be best described as a razor-sharp shield with a long chain that almost gives it the appearance of a deadly yo-yo, and players had to navigate levels until they faced the final boss, Rygar. The original role-playing game did not have an elaborate plot and merely stated that a new dominator, Rygar, with a human's body and a lion's head, had taken over the planet. The protagonist, Rygar, was tasked with defeating Rygar in a large throne room, and success resulted in a display that stated that peace had finally been restored, along with a warning for future threats. While the original game lacked major world building, Rygar was eventually expanded into NES and Lynx versions that expanded on the story and received great praise for incorporating the game's original RPG elements with a modern twist. The gameplay allowed players to move from left to right, jump, duck, attack, and climb ropes, and Rygar could also briefly stun enemies and collect items such as screen bombs, bonus points, extra lives, and time. Some levels also had a buy-in feature wherein players could buy more lives with in-game currency, but this feature was disabled in the last few levels to encourage players to develop the skills necessary to emerge victorious in the final levels. Gate of Doom, Dark Seal. Just like Kadash, Gate of Doom was in development in the late 80s before finally releasing in 1990 for the arcade. It was also known as Dark Seal, and it was developed by Data East as an isometric role-playing beat-em-up video game. The game could be played in single-player as well as multiplayer modes, and players had to travel across levels while dodging or fighting enemies, avoiding traps and collecting spells and items to boost their levels. Players could pick between characters such as Knight, Wizard, bard, or ninja, who all had their unique advantages while navigating the dungeons and facing the monsters that were lurking in the shadows waiting to kill them. Over time, Gate of Doom was ported to the Zeebo by Onum Games, and was eventually also developed for PlayStation 4, Nintendo Switch, and Xbox One. Castle of Dragon. Released for the arcade by Athena and Taito in June 1989, Castle of Dragon was a straightforward hack-and-slash action game that revolved around a dragon, Zuriv. The plot follows Zuriv's invasion of the kingdom of Wenleri, while the kings Duke and Narda take it upon themselves to defeat the dragon and rescue the distressed princess who had been captured by Zuriv. The characters had a range of weapons, including swords, shields, maces, axes, fire swords, and armor, as they embarked on a 6-stage journey to defeat the dragon. While some levels have easy missions, such as finding a key, some other levels focus on one-on-one combat and brutal fights against dragons with multiple types of breath. When players are successful against these hurdles, they finally face Zuriv, a gigantic green dragon who poses quite a challenge. The game also has a gimmick where players can fight against their rival in a 2-player game to win the princess's favor at the end. Even though Castle of a Dragon was a relatively unknown game at the time, it managed to receive an NES port and has become a forgotten gem over time. Legend of Hero Tonma. Released by Irem in 1989, Legend of Hero Tonma is a side-scrolling platform game that was listed in Game Machine's curation of the most popular arcade games upon its release. The game revolved around a caped hero named Tonma, or Tommy, who embarked on an adventure to rescue a princess and fight any opponents that created obstacles along the way. He had the ability to jump on the enemies' heads, to temporarily stun them, or even shoot fireballs that could be upgraded in power over the course of the game. The game had 7 stages before the caped hero finally managed to rescue the princess, and it was filled with comic visuals and an engaging storyline that left players wanting more. During each level, the player had to navigate terrains such as ruins, cliffs, statues, and dungeons before finally making it to the castle, and every single one of these levels ended with the player facing a boss that had to be defeated in order to proceed to the next stage. Legend of Hero Tonma was greatly praised by fans upon its release, and was soon ported to the TurboGrafx 16, Wii, Virtual Console, and Wii U. Rastan Saga. Also known as Rastan, Rastan Saga was a side-scrolling hack-and-slash arcade game developed by Taito in 1987. The game was a huge hit upon its release and was set in a fantasy world in a single-player mode. It followed the adventures of Rastan, a ruler who recounts his past adventures and eventual rise to kingship. As we explore his story, players assume Rastan's character as a barbaric knave who initially survived by committing petty crimes and murders. Along the way, he got an opportunity to kill monsters to save the kingdom of Kim in exchange for hefty rewards, and he then dedicated himself towards fighting mythical monsters such as chimeras and harpies. Over the course of his story arc, Rastan confronts a gigantic fire-breathing dragon with magical abilities and gains enough rewards to discover new land and establish a kingdom of his own. However, the game ends with Rastan concluding that there are several stories in his future and that the game's events were just a small part of a bigger story. The arcade game could be played using an 8-way joystick, wherein players could determine the height of Rastan's jumps and make decisions regarding the direction in which he swings his swords while maintaining his health. It had 6 rounds that took place across the outdoors, the castle, as well as the throne room, and players had to fight 6 bosses, including King Grayton, King Slay, Simplegades, Lewis, the Hydra, and the Dragon to emerge victorious. Rastan was such a huge success that it was eventually ported to the Game Gear and the MSX2, and it was described as a beautifully drawn game with realistic graphics, addictive gameplay, and a fast-paced storyline. Magic Sword, developed by Capcom in the late 80s, Magic Sword: Heroic Fantasy was a 1990 hack-and-slash video game where players had to make their way through a mystical tower to save the world. The game took place in an unnamed world where the Dark Lord Drakmar had taken control of an evil artifact known as the Black Orb. To prevent Drakmar from ruling over the world, the hero, aka the Brave One, had to make his way through a 50-floor tall tower called Dragon Keep to defeat him. The game had two endings where players could either destroy the Black Orb or take control of it to replace Drakmar as the new lord. Players had access to weapons such as swords, axes, or even magic, and they could also recruit allies such as Big Man, Knight, Lizard Man, Ninja, Thief, and Wizard along the way. Players also had a magic meter as well as a health bar, and the game had about 50 levels and multiple endings. Initially, Capcom wanted to program the game so that players could have up to 2 allies in a game, and they also developed many last-minute features, such as secret doors. After the success of the role-playing game, it was eventually released for PlayStation, Xbox, and Nintendo Switch. Valkyrie No Densetsu. Developed and published by Namco, Valkyrie No Densetsu is a 1989 action-adventure RPG that was released as a follow-up to Valkyrie no Boken. Players controlled a warrior maiden named Valkyrie and her lizard-like companion named Kuniro Zandra as they embarked on an adventure across the fictional Marvel land. The game's designer, Hiroshi Fuji, was inspired by Viking tales from Northern Europe and the Middle Ages, and he emphasized on a magical feel and characters with personality and depth to capture this aesthetic. The game was initially supposed to be a 4-player action game, but it was eventually released in a single-player and a multiplayer mode. The plot followed Valkyrie and Kurino as they traveled across the lands to drop the mythical golden seed into the northern fountain to replenish the dying crops of Zandraland. Along the way, they had to collect gold in order to buy magical spells and weapons, and also defeat opponents such as Camus. The game was spread across 8 locations, including plateaus, caves, dungeons, and ice fields, and both characters had projectile weapons that could be shot at the opponents to defeat them. Valkyrie no Densetsu received great critical acclaim upon its initial release, and it was soon released for PlayStation, Windows, and Wii Virtual Control. Marvelous verdict. And with that, we have explored all of the major RPG games of the 80s, ranging from medieval fantasy games such as Kadash to other action-adventure RPGs such as Gate of Doom and Rastan Saga. While these games have been forgotten over time, there is no doubt that they have left behind quite a legacy with their PlayStation and Xbox versions. We hope you found some recommendations to revisit through this list, and we would love to hear your favorite picks in the comments below.